The office building stood tall in the heart of the city. During the day, it was always full of noise, movement, and constant activity. People hurried from one meeting to another, typing on keyboards, answering phones, and rushing to meet deadlines. But at night, once the employees had left, the building took on an entirely different life. The silence echoed through the empty halls, broken only by the sound of one man's quiet footsteps. He was the janitor. Nobody really noticed him during the day. He worked in silence, blending into the background, moving from one corner of the office to another with his mop, bucket, and a small cart of supplies. He never spoke much, never joined in conversations, and never seemed interested in office gossip. While most workers filled the cafeteria with laughter and chatter during breaks, he quietly cleaned the tables, keeping his head down. The CEO of the company had seen him several times while leaving late from work. At first, he paid little attention, just another staff member doing his job. But over time, the CEO started to notice something unusual. The janitor was always the last one to leave. No matter how late it got, whether it was 9 p.m. or even close to midnight, the janitor was still there, finishing up his duties. And when he finally left, he didn't take a cab or bus like most employees. Instead, he walked out alone, carrying an old bag slung over his shoulder. There was something almost mysterious about him. His silence was not the kind that came from shyness. It felt like a silence filled with stories untold. The CEO couldn't explain why, but he found himself more and more curious about this man. One evening, as the CEO walked past the lobby, he slowed down to watch the janitor clean. The man moved with surprising patience, carefully wiping each surface as if it were more than just routine. He wasn't rushing to finish. Every action seemed deliberate, almost thoughtful. It was clear he took pride in his work, even though no one really acknowledged it. The CEO wondered, why would someone who lived such a quiet life never seem to complain? Most employees often asked for promotions, better pay, or recognition. But this janitor never asked for anything. He just worked, night after night, as if nothing else mattered. The thought lingered with the CEO long after he left the building. He tried to brush it off, telling himself he had more important things to focus on: big projects, shareholders, board meetings. Yet every time he stayed late and saw the janitor again, his curiosity grew stronger. It wasn't just his silence. It was the way he carried himself. The janitor didn't look like a man defeated by life. His eyes, though tired, held a quiet strength. And that old bag he carried every night, what was inside it? Why did he always leave so late, walking into the night without looking back? A few employees had noticed the same thing. In hushed conversations, they sometimes whispered about the janitor. "Strange fellow," one said. "Doesn't talk to anyone." Another replied, "Yeah, but he works harder than all of us combined." Then the subject would quickly change, because to most, he was just the janitor, someone invisible. But to the CEO, invisibility wasn't something he could ignore anymore. The man seemed to be hiding something, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that hinted at a deeper story. And the more the CEO thought about it, the more he wanted to know the truth. He began paying closer attention. From his office window, he would sometimes watch as the janitor moved between floors, emptying trash cans, wiping down glass doors, polishing the elevators. Every time, the janitor looked focused, almost as if cleaning was more than a job. It was a duty. And then there was the bag. That same worn-out bag. The janitor never left without it. It wasn't large, but it seemed heavy, judging by the way he carried it with care. The CEO began wondering if it carried tools, personal belongings, or perhaps something else entirely. The mystery kept gnawing at him. One night, while waiting for an important call, the CEO stayed later than usual. It was close to midnight when he finally stepped out of his office. The building was quiet. Most lights had been turned off, except for the dim glow of emergency lamps. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of footsteps and the squeak of a cleaning cart. He walked down the hall and saw the janitor again. The man was bent over, scrubbing a stubborn stain on the floor. His sleeves were rolled up and sweat glistened on his forehead. Still, he worked patiently, as if he had all the time in the world. The CEO paused, watching. Something inside him stirred, a mix of respect and curiosity. Here was a man who had no audience, no applause, no one praising him, yet he worked as if the world was watching. That kind of quiet dignity was rare. The janitor didn't notice the CEO standing there. He finished scrubbing, wiped his hands on a rag, and pushed the cart down the hallway. A moment later, he picked up his bag from the corner and slung it over his shoulder. Then, just as always, he walked toward the exit. The CEO's eyes followed him until he disappeared into the night. That evening, the CEO couldn't sleep. Questions raced through his mind. Who was this man really? Why did he live such a quiet life? Where did he go every night with that bag? There had to be more to his story. And that was the moment the CEO made a decision. The next time he stayed late, he wouldn't just watch from a distance. He would follow. Not to invade the janitor's privacy, but to finally learn the truth about this mysterious man who worked in silence, hidden in plain sight. What the CEO didn't know was that this simple decision, born out of curiosity, would change his life forever. The following week, the CEO found himself staying later than usual. Some nights it was because of work. Other nights, if he was being honest with himself, it was because of the janitor. He didn't admit it to anyone, but the man had become something of a mystery in his mind, a puzzle he couldn't stop thinking about. He began noticing things he hadn't paid attention to before. The janitor had a rhythm, a routine that almost never changed. He moved from floor to floor in the same order, starting with the lobby, then the meeting rooms, then the offices, before making his way to the top floors where the executive offices were. He never wasted time, never lingered, and yet he never looked like he was rushing either. It was the bag that caught the CEO's eyes again and again. That old, weathered bag. Some nights it looked heavier than others, as if it carried something important. The janitor always held it close, almost protectively. He never set it down carelessly, and when he placed it on the floor, it was always within arm's reach. The CEO couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that bag held part of the answer. But he wasn't bold enough to ask, not yet. Instead, he kept watching. One night, as he worked late in his office, he looked out and saw the janitor passing by in the hallway. The man's face was calm, but his eyes seemed far away, lost in thought. He wasn't just cleaning. He was carrying something inside him, something heavy. The CEO could feel it, even from a distance. That evening, when the janitor finally left, the CEO felt a strange urge to follow him right then. He even rose from his chair, walked to the door, and paused. But at the last second, he stepped back. Something held him still. Maybe it was respect for the man's privacy. Maybe it was fear of what he might discover. Either way, he let the janitor go. The curiosity didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing day. During the mornings, while sipping his coffee, the CEO would catch himself thinking about the janitor. Who was he when he wasn't cleaning floors? Did he have a family? Did he live alone? Why did he stay so late? And why did he always walk instead of taking a bus or car? The questions piled up like papers on his desk. Even his assistants noticed the CEO's distraction. Long week, one asked kindly when he caught him staring blankly at his computer screen. The CEO smiled faintly and nodded, but he didn't explain. How could he? How could he admit that he was spending so much mental energy thinking about the company janitor? The truth was, something about the man stirred a feeling the CEO hadn't felt in years. Humility. The CEO had everything people admired: power, wealth, respect, a corner office with glass walls that looked over the city. And yet, when he watched the janitor sweeping the floors in silence, he felt strangely small. This man, unnoticed by almost everyone, seemed to carry himself with more dignity than many of the people in suits. One night, the CEO decided to test his own patience. He purposely stayed until almost midnight, waiting for the moment the janitor would leave. He pretended to be busy with documents, but in reality, his eyes kept darting to the hallway clock. At last, he saw him. The janitor rolled his cart back to the storage room, placed the mop and supplies inside, then walked quietly to the locker where he always picked up his bag. The same bag, with frayed edges and faded fabric. He slung it over his shoulder like it was an old friend, nodded once at the security guard in the lobby, and stepped outside into the night. This time, the CEO followed. He didn't trail too close, afraid of being noticed. He kept a careful distance, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. The city was quiet at that hour, with only a few cars passing now and then. Street lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the ground. The janitor walked with steady steps, not hurried, but not slow either. His path wasn't random. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. He avoided the main roads, choosing smaller side streets, darker alleys, places most people wouldn't wander at night. The CEO's heart pounded as he followed. It felt strange, almost unreal. Here he was, a man who usually commanded rooms filled with top executives, now sneaking behind one of his own employees like a curious child. But he couldn't stop. The more he watched, the more questions burned inside him. What was this man hiding? The janitor finally turned down a narrow lane. The CEO hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should continue. But his feet carried him forward anyway. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though he was moving closer not just to the janitor, but to a truth that could change everything. As the CEO's eyes adjusted to the dim light of the street, he saw something he hadn't expected. The janitor stopped, not at a home, not at a bus stop, not at any place that looked like it belonged to him. Instead, he entered a part of the city the CEO rarely visited. And it was there, in that quiet corner, that the CEO would begin to understand just how little he knew about the man he had been watching for so long. The city looked different at night. The tall glass towers that shined so brightly in the day now loomed like sleeping giants, their lights dimmed, their windows dark. The streets were quiet except for the occasional sound of a car passing by or the faint barking of a stray dog in the distance. The janitor walked with steady steps, never turning back, never slowing down. The old bag bounced lightly against his side, as if it carried a weight, both physical and invisible. The CEO followed from several paces behind, careful not to draw attention to himself. At first, he thought the man would head toward a bus stop or maybe a modest apartment. But the janitor walked in the opposite direction of the busy roads. He took alleys that grew narrower, sidewalks cracked and uneven. The deeper they went, the fewer streetlights there were. The CEO hesitated once or twice, wondering if he was going too far. What was he doing, really? He was a CEO of a massive company, and here he was, sneaking through back streets in the middle of the night, following a man whose life should have had nothing to do with his own. But something about the janitor's quiet persistence, the way he carried himself, kept pulling the CEO forward. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, the janitor stopped in front of an old, worn-down building on the edge of the city. The windows were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the front steps sagged under years of neglect. But there was a light glowing faintly inside. The CEO ducked behind a tree and watched. The janitor set his bag down, pulled something out, and pushed the door open with practiced ease. The sound that followed startled the CEO. Laughter. Not the kind you hear in office cafeterias or late-night bars. This was softer, warmer, children's laughter. The janitor stepped inside, and through the doorway the CEO could now see more clearly. It wasn't just a building. It was a shelter. Inside, a small group of people sat on old benches and blankets. Some were huddled in coats that looked too thin for the night's chill. Others clutched small children, rocking them gently. The janitor walked among them like he belonged there, as if this was his second home. From the bag, he pulled out containers, food neatly packed, wrapped in cloth. He opened each one and began handing out meals. One by one, he gave plates to the hungry, his face calm, his movements careful. The CEO's eyes widened. This man, the same man who scrubbed office floors in silence, was feeding the homeless in the dead of night. He leaned closer, straining to hear. The voices inside were faint, but he caught snippets. A young boy tugged at the janitor's sleeve and whispered, "Thank you." An older woman clasped his hands and said, "You always come back. You never forget us." The janitor smiled faintly and nodded, as if their gratitude wasn't needed. He continued handing out food until everyone had something to eat. Then he reached back into the bag and pulled out a few warm blankets, placing them gently around the shoulders of those who shivered. The CEO felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had passed this man in the halls without a second thought. Just another janitor, another face in the crowd. But here, in the quiet of the night, the truth unfolded before him. This wasn't just a man cleaning floors. This was a man saving lives in his own quiet way. The CEO pressed his back against the tree, his heart pounding. A wave of guilt swept over him. How many times had he walked by the janitor without so much as a nod? How many times had he overlooked the humanity of someone standing right in front of him? He watched as the janitor crouched down beside a child, offering a smile and a piece of bread. The child's face lit up with joy. In that moment, the janitor looked nothing like a worker in faded overalls. He looked like a guardian, someone carrying the weight of others without complaint. The CEO stayed hidden for a long while, watching every small act of kindness. There were no cameras, no reporters, no applause. The janitor didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he cared. When the food was gone and the shelter grew quiet, the janitor sat with the group, listening to their stories, nodding patiently as they spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer pity. He simply sat with them, present in a way few people ever were. The CEO felt his chest tighten. For years, he had lived in a world of wealth, meetings, and business deals. Success for him was measured in numbers, in profits, in achievements. But here was a man who measured success in the simplest acts of humanity: feeding the hungry, warming the cold, listening to the forgotten. It was humbling. It was overwhelming. The CEO realized he had stumbled into something far greater than a mystery. He had uncovered a truth about life that money could never buy. Quietly, he stepped back, careful not to be seen. His mind was spinning, his heart unsettled. He had set out that night looking for answers about a janitor's strange behavior. What he found instead was a lesson he would never forget. He turned and walked back toward the city lights, the image of the janitor's gentle smile still burning in his mind. That night, as the CEO lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. All he could see was the worn bag, the small containers of food, and the faces of people whose lives were lit by the kindness of one man. He knew this was only the beginning. The city was quiet as the CEO walked back to his car. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had expected answers that night, but what he saw left him with even more questions. The janitor, the silent man who mopped floors and emptied trash cans, was living a life no one at the company could have imagined. As he sat behind the wheel, the CEO didn't start the engine right away. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared at the dark road ahead. His thoughts swirled. Why hadn't he seen it before? For years, he had passed this man in the hallway. He had nodded politely at him, maybe said a quick good night on his way out, but never more. To him, the janitor was just another employee. Necessary but invisible. Someone who did a job, collected a paycheck, and faded into the background. But tonight, that image shattered. This janitor wasn't invisible at all. He was carrying out acts of kindness so powerful that they left the CEO speechless. Quiet, uncelebrated, unseen, yet deeply meaningful. The CEO leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He thought about the people he had seen inside the shelter. The tired faces, the worn hands, the small children smiling over pieces of bread. He thought about the way they looked at the janitor, with trust and gratitude, as if he was the only person who had remembered them. And then guilt washed over him. Here he was, a man of influence, power, and resources. His company made millions every year. He sat at the top of a building filled with bright lights and endless luxuries. Yet never once had he thought about the people living just beyond the glow of the city. People cold, hungry, and forgotten. But the janitor had thought of them. The janitor, with his small paycheck and old bag, had managed to do more for those people than the CEO had ever done with all his wealth. The CEO started the car, but instead of heading home, he found himself driving slowly through the streets, replaying everything he had seen. He passed expensive restaurants with shining windows, shops filled with goods, and streets lit with neon signs. And yet, just a few blocks away, there were shelters where people were simply thankful for bread and blankets. It opened his eyes in a way nothing else had. When he finally got home, he didn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the city skyline from his window. The faces of the people at the shelter wouldn't leave his mind. Neither would the image of the janitor's quiet determination. The next morning at work, the CEO found himself distracted again. In meetings, when people spoke about profits and quarterly goals, his mind drifted back to that old bag and the way the janitor carried it. When someone asked him about an upcoming deal, he answered quickly, but without his usual energy. Later that evening, as employees began leaving, the CEO stayed behind. He wanted to see the janitor again. Sure enough, just like always, the janitor appeared in the hallway with his cart, quietly pushing it from office to office. His movements were calm, unhurried, steady. The CEO watched him for a long moment, then stepped closer. "Evening," the CEO said softly. The janitor looked up and nodded politely. "Evening, sir." The CEO wanted to say more, to ask him about the shelter, the food, the children. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded and walked on, his mind filled with thoughts he wasn't ready to share. That night, the CEO didn't follow him. He didn't need to. He already knew where the janitor was going. He pictured the man walking through the streets, carrying his bag of food, stepping into the shelter, and quietly serving others. For the first time in years, the CEO felt small, not in a humiliating way, but in a humbling one. He realized that while he sat in boardrooms making decisions that affected markets, this janitor was out there making decisions that affected lives. And it stirred something deep inside him. The following week, the CEO stayed late again. He wanted to see if what he had witnessed was just one night or if it was part of the janitor's life. And sure enough, just as before, the janitor finished his work, picked up his bag, and disappeared into the night. This time, the CEO followed at a distance, but with a calmer heart. He wasn't chasing curiosity anymore. He was watching with respect. When they reached the shelter, the scene unfolded just like before. The janitor handed out food, spoke kindly to those around him, and gave out blankets with a gentle smile. The people greeted him with warmth, as if he was family. The CEO stayed in the shadows again, unseen. He didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to steal the moment. Instead, he simply observed, his respect for the man growing deeper with every passing minute. By the time the CEO walked away, one thought had taken root in his mind. This janitor had been living a double life, not in the sense of hiding something shameful, but in the sense of carrying a quiet nobility that the world often overlooks. And now that the CEO had seen it, he knew he could never see the man the same way again. That night, as he drove home, the CEO made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know what it meant yet or how he would do it, but he knew one thing for certain. He could not stay the same after what he had discovered. The CEO couldn't shake the thought of the janitor's double life. Night after night, he found himself staying late, sometimes working, sometimes just waiting, watching the man move quietly through the building. And every time the janitor picked up that same old bag and walked out into the night, the CEO's respect for him grew. But there was still one question that wouldn't leave his mind. Why? Why did the janitor, with such limited means, dedicate himself to helping strangers? Where did that strength come from? What had shaped him into the man he was? One evening, the CEO made a decision. Instead of hiding in the shadows, instead of silently following, he would step forward. He wanted to hear the truth directly from the man himself. That night, he waited by the lobby as the janitor finished his rounds. When the man returned his cart to the storage room and grabbed his bag, the CEO walked toward him. Heading out, the CEO asked gently. The janitor paused, a little surprised to see the CEO still there at such an hour. "Yes, sir. Just finished." The CEO hesitated, then said quietly, "Mind if I walk with you?" The janitor blinked, clearly not expecting the request. "Of course, sir. If you'd like." So the two men stepped out into the night together. For a while, neither spoke. The city was calm, the air cool, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly against the empty streets. Finally, the CEO broke the silence. "I've noticed you're always the last to leave. You work hard, and then you walk home so late. I couldn't help but wonder, where do you go every night? The janitor was quiet for a moment, as though weighing his words. Then he sighed softly. I go to a place that needs me, sir. A place where people don't have much. Some of them don't have anything at all. The CEO nodded. I know. I've seen it. The janitor stopped walking. His eyes turned sharply to the CEO, surprised. You've seen? The CEO nodded again, his voice calm. I followed you one night. I saw what you do. The food, the blankets, the way they look at you. I saw it all. For the first time, the janitor's face changed. His calm expression flickered with something else, embarrassment, maybe even shame. He lowered his head. I never wanted anyone to know. It's not something I do for attention. The CEO's voice was steady. I know. That's why it moved me even more. They walked again, more slowly this time. After a few steps, the janitor spoke quietly. I wasn't always like this. Years ago, I had a good life. I had a job, a family, a home. But life, it doesn't always stay the same. I lost everything in a short time. My family, my home, my dignity. For months, I was on the streets myself. The CEO felt his chest tighten. He looked at the man beside him in disbelief. The quiet janitor, the man who swept his halls every night, had once been homeless. I know what it feels like, the janitor continued, his voice heavy but calm. The hunger, the cold, the shame of being invisible to the world. People pass you by like you don't exist. That pain stays with you. Even when life gives you another chance, you never forget it. He adjusted the strap of his bag and looked ahead. When I finally got this job, I promised myself I would never turn away from those still suffering. So every night, I take what I can, food, clothes, blankets, and I go back to the people I once sat beside. Because I know what it means to be forgotten. The CEO walked in silence, his heart weighed down by the man's words. He could picture it. The janitor on a cold sidewalk, overlooked by the same kind of people who now worked in his building. Why didn't you ever ask for help? The CEO asked softly. The janitor shook his head. Because this isn't about me. It's about them. I don't need recognition. I don't need anyone to know. I just need to do what I can, as quietly as I can. The CEO swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside him. Respect, sadness, admiration. Here was a man who had lived through pain, rebuilt himself, and now dedicated his life to easing the suffering of others, all without asking for a single word of praise. They reached the corner where the janitor usually turned off, the path that led to the shelter. He stopped and looked at the CEO. This is where I go, sir. But I should continue alone. These people, they trust me. They don't expect anyone else to come. The CEO nodded, understanding. I won't intrude. But thank you for trusting me with your story. The janitor gave a small smile, the kind that came from deep humility. Thank you for listening. As the janitor walked away into the shadows, the CEO stood still, watching him go. His mind was heavy, but his heart felt strangely lighter. He had finally heard the truth. The janitor wasn't silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he had already lived through the kind of pain most people couldn't imagine. And his silence had turned into action, quiet but powerful, night after night. As the CEO walked back alone, one thought stayed with him. This man, overlooked by nearly everyone, carried more wisdom and strength than many leaders he had met in boardrooms. It was humbling. It was unforgettable. That night, long after the janitor had walked away into the darkness, the CEO remained still. The city was quiet, but inside his mind, there was no silence. His thoughts echoed like voices in a crowded room. He replayed the janitor's words again and again. I know what it feels like. The hunger, the cold, the shame of being invisible. It struck him in a way nothing else had. For all his years in business, for all his meetings, contracts, and accomplishments, he had never faced anything close to what this man had endured. And yet here the janitor was, not bitter, not broken, but stronger, humbler, and more compassionate than anyone the CEO had ever met. That night, sleep didn't come. The CEO sat in his study, staring at the city skyline as dawn began to break. The tall towers stood proud against the morning light, but his eyes drifted to the streets below. Somewhere in those streets, people were waking up cold and hungry. Somewhere, children were starting another day with empty stomachs. And yet, somewhere else, a janitor was already preparing himself for another quiet night of service. The CEO knew then that he couldn't return to life as usual. The following day at work, he carried himself differently. His assistants noticed it first. He wasn't rushing from one meeting to another. He wasn't glued to his phone. His eyes seemed softer, thoughtful, distant at times. When evening came, he didn't leave early. He waited again. This time, he didn't hide when he saw the janitor with his bag. Instead, he walked up and said gently, "Would you allow me to come with you tonight?" The janitor hesitated. His eyes searched the CEO's face, as if to test his sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "If you wish." Together, they walked to the shelter. For the CEO, it was his first time stepping inside that worn-down building. The smell of old wood and faint cooking greeted him. The air was heavy with stories of hardship. Faces turned when he entered, but it wasn't him they noticed. It was the janitor. Children ran to him. Mothers smiled with relief. Old men nodded with respect. The janitor opened his bag and began his usual routine, handing out food, blankets, and kind words. The CEO stood by, watching, feeling almost like an outsider. His expensive suit felt out of place in a room filled with people who owned so little. One child clutched a piece of bread and looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you his friend?" she asked, pointing to the janitor. The CEO paused, then smiled softly. "Yes, I am." The words felt strange, but true. For the rest of the night, the CEO stayed quiet, watching, listening, and learning. He saw how the janitor treated each person with dignity, how he never rushed, never looked down on anyone. He wasn't just handing out food, he was handing out hope. When they left the shelter later, the CEO finally spoke. "You've been doing this alone for so long. Let me help you." The janitor shook his head gently. "I never wanted this to be a burden on anyone else. It's something I promised myself I would do." "But imagine," the CEO said carefully, "how much more we could do together. You've been carrying this alone. What if we could feed more people, give more blankets, create something bigger?" The janitor looked down at his old bag, then back at the CEO. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he replied, "If it helps them, then yes. But not for recognition, not for headlines, only for them." The CEO nodded firmly. Only for them. And so, things began to change. In the weeks that followed, the CEO used his influence and resources, but in a way he never had before. Quietly, without fanfare, he began supporting the shelter. Food supplies increased. More blankets arrived. Repairs were made to the old building. And through it all, the janitor remained at the center, guiding it with his quiet wisdom. The CEO insisted that the janitor's work remain respected, not overshadowed. "This started with you," he told him one evening, "and it will always be yours." Word slowly spread, not through newspapers or press releases, but through the people whose lives were touched. Families whispered of the kind janitor who fed them, of the shelter that had suddenly grown warmer and safer. And though they never knew the CEO was behind it, he didn't mind. That wasn't the point. For the CEO, the transformation was personal. He no longer saw his company in the same way. Meetings and profits still mattered, but now there was a new measure of success: how many lives they could quietly uplift. And every time he passed the janitor in the hallway, he no longer saw a silent worker with a mop. He saw a man who had endured life's harshest storms and emerged with a heart big enough to shelter others. One evening, as the two men stood outside the shelter after another long night, the CEO said softly, "You once told me you knew what it felt like to be invisible. I want you to know, you're not invisible anymore. Not to me. Not to anyone whose life you've touched." The janitor gave a small smile, the kind that came from peace rather than pride. "I don't need to be seen, sir. I just need to keep going." The CEO nodded. "And I'll be there with you." That night, as they walked back together under the city lights, two men from different worlds, one with power, the other with quiet humility, shared the same path. The CEO realized his life had changed forever, not because of a deal or a contract, but because he had followed a silent janitor one night and discovered the meaning of true leadership: service. And from that day on, he vowed never to overlook the quiet heroes again.